In the endless expanse of space, there were few places as isolated as the research station of Xavi. It was nestled on the barren moon of an uninhabited planet, far from the bustling trade routes of the galaxy. Xavi had chosen this solitude for a reason. They were a Chevron, an alien scientist who valued peace, knowledge, and silence above all else. The Chevron were a species of quiet thinkers, long removed from the violence of war. They thrived in calm, remote spaces where they could conduct their research without the distractions of conflict or politics. But that peace was about to be shattered. Xavi sat in their observation chamber, watching the stars drift past the station's panoramic window. The stars were as familiar to them as the patterns of their own thoughts, yet today one of them didn't belong. A small, strange object was drifting toward the station. It was nothing like the ships or debris Xavi usually studied. This object seemed out of place. It wasn't large, just the size of a small escape pod, but it was coming toward the station at an odd angle, as if it had been set adrift by some unknown force. Xavi's 3 large eyes narrowed in interest, a soft buzz coming from the interface beside them. They quickly ran a scan to analyze the object. The results were puzzling. Alien, yes, but the readings were inconsistent. The materials in the pod were unlike anything Xavi had encountered before, a mix of organic and mechanical components. And then there was the signal, a faint distress call coming from inside. Curious, Xavi murmured to themselves, their voice soft, almost musical in its tone. The Chevron had long since abandoned the need for such primitive technology. Their species communicated through neural link-ups, their minds connected directly to their machines. But this signal, it was old human. Xavi didn't hesitate. The thrill of discovery surged through their elongated limbs as they prepared to bring the pod aboard the station. They operated the station's tractor beam with practiced precision, gently guiding the escape pod toward the docking bay. It was an exciting moment, a moment of rare, unexpected discovery. The pod was small, metallic, and battered. Xavi's tentacle-like appendages worked quickly to detach it from the docking clamps and secure it inside. Once it was safely aboard, Xavi floated toward it, curiosity burning in their chest. They had studied many species, studied their biology, their technologies, their cultures. But this was something new, something unknown. Xavi slowly approached the pod, their long, slender fingers hovering above the control panel. The distress signal was still weak but persistent. It was definitely a cry for help. With a smooth motion, Xavi opened the pod's hatch. Inside was something Xavi hadn't expected, a small, fragile creature. It was human. The creature, no more than a toddler, lay curled up in a tight ball. Its skin was soft and pale, its hair sparse and fine. It looked so fragile, so vulnerable. Xavi's 3 eyes blinked in surprise. They had heard of humans before, of course. Every species in the galaxy had. They were a lost, ancient race that had disappeared from the galactic scene long ago. Some said they had been wiped out in a long-forgotten war. Others believed humans were still out there, hidden in distant corners of space. But to find one, alive, breathing, and helpless, was something Xavi had never imagined. Xavi's initial shock faded into curiosity. They gently reached out with one of their long fingers and touched the small human's head. The child was warm to the touch, and as Xavi's finger made contact, the tiny human stirred, a soft sound escaping its mouth. Xavi's heart, though not capable of human emotions in the way that humans felt them, still fluttered with something they couldn't quite place. A sense of responsibility, perhaps. It was clear that this child had been abandoned, left alone in the void of space. The Chevron had always prided themselves on their calm, logical nature, but there was something about this fragile human that triggered a deep protective instinct in Xavi. "Hello," Xavi whispered softly, unsure whether the child could understand their words. The Chevron didn't need words to communicate, but this small, fragile creature, it might not understand their kind of communication at all. Still, Xavi tried. The child's eyes opened slowly, revealing deep, wide blue eyes that seemed to stare straight into Zavi's soul. There was a moment of silence, and then, to Zavi's surprise, the child reached out with its tiny hand and grabbed one of Zavi's fingers. Zavi froze. The touch was unexpected but strangely meaningful. The child, despite its tiny size, had a surprising amount of strength in its grip. Zavi's three eyes widened as they processed this. This human, though small and seemingly helpless, was already displaying one of the most important traits that Zavi had read about in human biology: resilience. The child made a soft sound, like a whimper, but it wasn't afraid. Zavi's tendrils hovered over the small human, instinctively checking its vitals. It was alive, but weak. The pod had clearly not been built for comfort, and it was clear that the child had been traveling alone for quite some time. Zavi couldn't just leave it here, alone, in this cold, lifeless station. The child needed help, but what could Zavi do? The Zhevran had no experience with humans. They were a species of vast knowledge, yes, but they had never been tasked with caring for a human child. They had never needed to. The Zhevran preferred intellectual pursuits, research, and advancement, not the messy business of caregiving. But here, in front of them, was a living, breathing child, an alien species' most vulnerable form, and Zavi couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward it. Zavi placed the child carefully in a soft cradle, specially designed for their own species, but likely comfortable enough for the fragile human. The child whimpered again, but settled as Zavi adjusted the temperature controls to a warmer setting. "Stay safe," Zavi murmured. "I will care for you." Zavi's mind raced with questions. What had happened to the child's home? Where were its parents? Why was it alone in space? There were so many questions, so many things that Zavi didn't understand. But one thing was clear. The child had no place else to go. And Zavi, in their own way, had already made the decision to take responsibility for it. As Zavi walked away from the cradle, their mind began to work through the logistics. There were a million questions about human biology, their technology, their psychology. But at this moment, those didn't matter. What mattered was that this child, this fragile being, was now under Zavi's care. For better or worse, Zavi had made a choice, and in the cold silence of space, that choice meant everything. Days passed, and Zavi devoted themselves to learning everything they could about the child. They watched it sleep, studied its behavior, and noted every little quirk. The child, though small, was full of energy. It cried when hungry, giggled when amused, and even reached for Zavi's tentacles with surprising curiosity. Zavi spent hours researching human physiology and psychology, using data from the child's biometrics to tailor the station's environment to its needs. They even downloaded human language databases, hoping to learn more about the child's language and culture. But no matter how much Zavi studied, there was one thing they couldn't understand. How could a species so small, so fragile, survive in such an unforgiving universe? Zavi couldn't help but marvel at the resilience of the human child. It seemed to possess an innate strength, an ability to adapt to the unknown, in ways Zavi could only begin to comprehend. Perhaps the humans had been weaker than the Zhevran in physical form, but there was something in their spirit that Zavi could not ignore. One night, as Zavi watched the child sleep peacefully in the cradle, they whispered to the stillness of the station, "I do not know what comes next, but I will protect you. That is the only thing I know for sure." And in that moment, Zavi realized something that would change everything. They weren't just studying this human child anymore. They were becoming something new, a protector, a caregiver, and maybe even something more. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the galaxy beyond the station was vast. But Zavi knew one thing: they had a responsibility now, and they would not turn away from it. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life aboard the isolated research station had become a quiet routine for Zavi and the child, Emery. Zavi, once content to work alone, now found themselves swept up in the care of this tiny human. Emery was still small, but growing fast. Their blue eyes, always wide with curiosity, were now constantly searching, exploring, and learning. Xavi had thought they knew everything there was to know about the child, but every day brought new surprises. One thing was clear: Emery was no ordinary child. The human child was not just physically adaptable. Their mind worked in ways Xavi had never expected. Emery had begun to learn quickly, more quickly than Xavi had anticipated. Every time Xavi tried to teach Emery something, the child absorbed the information faster than expected. Whether it was a language, a piece of technology, or a concept from Xavi's vast knowledge of the universe, Emery absorbed it like a sponge. There was an unexpected brilliance in that little human, something that Xavi had not fully appreciated before. Xavi's lab became the place where they both spent most of their time. Emery loved the lab, fascinated by all the strange devices, floating tools, and holographic screens that surrounded them. Xavi had a particular interest in technology and engineering, and it was easy to see that Emery shared that interest, though their approach was far more creative and chaotic. One morning, Xavi was working at their console, analyzing data from a recent experiment involving energy sources from different planets, when Emery wandered over, as they often did, to poke around the station's equipment. Xavi had learned to be careful around Emery. The child had a tendency to tamper with anything that was left unattended. Emery's tiny hands had been the cause of more than one accident, from turning off critical systems to accidentally triggering emergency alarms. Xavi had a hunch that Emery was learning to play with the technology intentionally, rather than out of mere curiosity. "Emery," Xavi called, "please, be careful with that. It's a delicate system." But Emery didn't listen. Instead, the child's small fingers flew over a set of controls on a nearby panel. Xavi groaned softly, realizing what was happening a moment too late. Emery was now playing with the main communication device. The device had a series of functions that could connect to any communication network, but it was designed to only transmit signals to known stations and ships in the area. It was not meant for random intergalactic connections. Xavi floated over to the console and quickly began trying to stop Emery, but it was too late. Emery, with a giggle of triumph, had already pushed a sequence of buttons that triggered a connection to a much larger network. A restricted one, to be precise. Xavi's heart skipped a beat as the system hummed to life. The system flashed with warning signals. It had connected to a deep galactic database, a communication network used by the ancient galactic powers. The type of system that was not meant to be accessed by anyone, let alone a curious human child. Xavi stared in shock as the screen blinked, displaying encrypted messages and a long list of military communications, treaties, and classified records. This was far beyond the level of access they had ever intended to allow. Xavi quickly grabbed Emery, pulling the child away from the panel. "No, Emery, what have you done?" they exclaimed, their voice laced with panic. Emery just giggled, completely unaware of the magnitude of their actions. Xavi's tentacle-like appendages worked frantically, trying to disengage the system from the illegal connection. They knew that the moment this connection was traced, their station would be discovered. The consequences would be severe. The Zevran, who had spent millennia avoiding the troubles of interstellar politics, would now be dragged into something much larger than they had ever expected. Xavi's mind raced. If anyone discovered that a human was alive and living aboard their station, especially a child with the ability to hack into such high-security systems, it would be disastrous. Humans had been considered extinct for centuries, their fate sealed after a catastrophic war. But legends remained about humans, their potential to adapt, to survive, and to grow into something greater than anyone could predict. And now, Xavi had unknowingly given the galaxy a glimpse of what humanity might be capable of. Xavi disconnected the system and shut everything down, but it was already too late. The data had been transmitted. The encrypted messages and hidden files were already on their way to places Xavi could not control. Someone somewhere would soon realize that the ancient myths of humanity were true, and they would come for Emery. As the system powered down, Xavi's pulse quickened. They floated back to Emery, who was still looking at them with wide, innocent eyes, clearly unaware of the consequences of their actions. "We have to leave," Xavi whispered, more to themselves than to Emery. "We've made a mistake." Xavi's thoughts were clouded with fear. Their quiet, solitary existence had just been shattered by a small human child who had unknowingly opened a door that should never have been opened. Xavi had always considered themselves a careful scientist, one who followed the rules, who calculated every outcome before taking action. But now, they had made a grave error. Xavi gently took Emery's hand and led them away from the now-quiet console. The child had no idea what was happening, but Xavi could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier by the second. They needed to hide. They needed to leave the station before someone came looking for Emery. But how? Xavi quickly ran a series of scans across the station. The connection had been made to several distant points across the galaxy. The signals would be traced, and Xavi knew it wouldn't take long for someone to track down the source. The danger was not just to them, but to Emery. Humans had been a forgotten species for so long, and no one knew what would happen if they reappeared. There were rumors, of course, whispers of humans being a threat to the established order of the galaxy. The Jevern had always believed humanity had been wiped out, but if there was even the slightest chance that they were wrong, the entire galaxy would want answers. Xavi hurriedly packed the few belongings they could carry. They knew they had to leave the station immediately. Emery, still oblivious to the gravity of the situation, watched them pack with curious eyes, occasionally touching a piece of equipment or a strange artifact on the walls. Xavi wanted to reassure the child, to tell them that everything would be okay, but Xavi wasn't sure themselves. The Jevern had avoided intergalactic conflict for centuries. They didn't have the weapons or the strength to stand up to the powerhouses of the galaxy. But now, Xavi found themselves in a position they had never expected, one where survival might depend on how quickly they could run, and how well they could hide Emery from the galaxy that was now aware of her existence. Xavi's mind raced as they looked at the small child in front of them. Emery was just a child, an innocent being with no knowledge of the danger that now surrounded them. Yet, Xavi couldn't ignore the feeling that Emery was something more. There was something powerful about the human species, something that Xavi had yet to fully understand. "I'll protect you," Xavi whispered, their voice soft but filled with determination. "I promise." And with that, Xavi sealed the station's doors, activated the emergency thrusters, and propelled their small craft away from the moon. As the stars slowly grew distant, Xavi glanced at Emery, who was now looking out the window with wide eyes, full of wonder. Xavi's heart pounded in their chest. They didn't know what lay ahead. They didn't know who would come for them. But one thing was certain. Emery was no longer just a curious child. Emery was the key to something much larger than anyone could ever imagine. And they had just made the mistake of opening Pandora's box. Xavi hoped, with all their being, that they could keep Emery safe. But in the vastness of space, nothing was ever certain. As the small spacecraft drifted further from the isolated station, Xavi's mind raced with a growing sense of urgency. The small craft, which had once been a place of comfort and solitude, now felt more like a prison. Every moment that passed, Xavi felt the weight of the situation heavier on their shoulders. Behind them, the station was nothing more than a dot in the vast emptiness of space, but it felt like a ticking time bomb. Whoever had intercepted the signals from the research station was now on their way, and they would not stop until they found Emery. Xavi turned their attention to the child, Emery, who was sitting quietly by the window, looking out at the stars. The child's innocent face, so full of wonder, only deepened the sense of urgency. Emery had no idea what danger they were in. The small human had been pulled into something far bigger than they could possibly understand. Xavi knew this was no simple mistake. The signals from the station had connected to a high-security network. Those messages were bound to be traced, and now the galaxy was aware of the existence of a living human. The myths of humanity's extinction had been shattered, and those who had long sought to control the galaxy would want to know why. Xavi had read the ancient texts about humans, stories of their intelligence, their adaptability, and their mysterious disappearance from the galactic stage. Some believed humans were wiped out in a devastating war. Others believed they had gone into hiding their secrets in forgotten corners of space. Whatever the truth, Xavi knew one thing. The galaxy would be hunting for Emery, and they would stop at nothing to find her. Xavi felt their heart tighten with fear. They had always lived a quiet life, a life of scientific exploration. They had never been part of the conflicts that ravaged the galaxy, and they had certainly never been a target. But now they were involved in something far larger than their understanding. The stars streaked past the small spacecraft, a never-ending ocean of twinkling lights that seemed to mock Xavi's growing sense of dread. The distant hum of the engines was the only sound in the quiet ship, and yet it was not enough to drown out the chaos swirling in Xavi's mind. The decision to run, to flee the safety of the research station, had come quickly, but with each passing moment, it felt like a mistake. Xavi wasn't just running from the galaxy's authorities. They were running from the unknown, from something bigger than themselves, and from the terrifying possibility that they might not be able to protect Emery. Xavi glanced over at the child, who was still sitting quietly by the window, their small face pressed up against the cool glass as they watched the stars. Emery was so innocent, so unaware of the danger that surrounded them. Xavi couldn't bear the thought of what would happen if they were caught. The child was the last of their kind, the last human, at least as far as the galaxy knew. The whispers of humans' existence had been nothing more than myth, a story passed down over centuries. Until now. Xavi had made a promise to themselves the moment they found Emery: "I will protect you." And as much as the pressure weighed on their shoulders, Xavi was determined to keep that promise. But the galaxy wasn't a forgiving place, especially when something as precious as a human child was involved. The question now was, what could Xavi do? They were no fighter, no warrior. The Zhevran were peaceful scholars, dedicated to knowledge and understanding, not to warfare. And they certainly didn't have the kind of power that would be required to hide Emery from the forces coming after them. Xavi had no illusions. It wasn't just a small, isolated group who would come looking for the child. It was the entire galaxy, powers with vast armies, fleets of warships, and untold resources. Xavi's mind raced. They had no weapons, no defense systems. All they had was the knowledge of the stars and the ability to hide in plain sight. That was the key, Xavi realized. If they could hide Emery well enough, long enough, maybe the hunt would die down. Maybe the galaxy would go on thinking humans were nothing more than a story. But that wasn't enough. Xavi needed to make a plan, and they needed to do it quickly. Xavi punched in a set of coordinates, aiming for the outer edges of the galaxy. There was a place, far from the reach of the galactic powers, a place that even the most sophisticated tracking systems couldn't easily find. It was a remote star system, known only to a handful of travelers and smugglers who used it as a safe haven. The ship jerked slightly as the engines engaged. Xavi watched Emery, whose eyes still sparkled with that same innocent curiosity, oblivious to the grave danger they were in. They had to make it there. They had to reach that place before the hunters found them. But as Xavi sat back in their seat, a cold sense of reality began to settle in. They could run. They could hide. But they couldn't outrun everything forever. There was a part of Xavi that knew that the galaxy would never let a human, any human, escape without a fight. The truth was, humans were considered dangerous. No one really knew what had happened to them, why they had disappeared from the galaxy, or if they were even capable of rebuilding. But one thing was clear: humans had left a mark on the galaxy, and no one wanted to forget that. Xavi was jolted out of their thoughts by a small, soft voice. "Xavi." Emery's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the quiet of the ship. Zavi turned their head, startled by the sudden sound. Emery was looking up at them, their small face serious, even for a child so young. "What's wrong?" Emery asked, their wide blue eyes staring up at Zavi, full of concern. Zavi blinked, caught off guard by the child's perceptiveness. They had been so consumed by their own fear, by the weight of the situation, that they hadn't stopped to think about how Emery might feel. The child had been through so much already, waking up alone in the cold, dark pod, drifting through space with no one but Zavi, and now running from an entire galaxy of unknown forces. Zavi took a deep breath. "Nothing, Emery. Everything is fine," Zavi said softly, trying to sound calm. "We're just going to a safe place. You'll be okay." But Emery wasn't convinced. The child's gaze remained steady, their brow furrowed with the wisdom of someone far older than their years. "You're lying," Emery said, almost matter-of-factly. "You're scared." Zavi froze. There was no use hiding it. Emery had already sensed the fear that Zavi had been trying to suppress. It was one of the things Zavi had come to realize about humans. They were remarkably intuitive. Maybe it was because they had to rely on each other for survival, or maybe it was just part of what made them unique. But Emery had already figured out that something wasn't right, and they were not going to ignore it. Zavi looked at the child, unsure how to respond. For the first time, the responsibility of caring for Emery felt too heavy to bear. It was no longer just about keeping the child safe. It was about explaining things that Zavi didn't fully understand themselves. How could they explain to Emery that the galaxy was hunting them? How could they explain that humans, once thought to be extinct, were seen as a dangerous threat? How could Zavi, who had never been involved in intergalactic politics, explain the risks of having a human child alive in the galaxy? Instead, Zavi simply sighed and said, "Yes, I'm scared. But I will protect you, no matter what." Emery didn't say anything else for a while, but Zavi could see the understanding in their eyes. There was a silent bond forming between them, one that went beyond words. Emery might not fully understand the scope of the danger they were in, but they understood that Zavi was the one person who would never abandon them. It wasn't long before they arrived at the remote star system. The place was nothing more than a quiet, dark corner of the galaxy, far from the major trade routes. The star was a faint, dying one, surrounded by a small collection of icy planets and asteroids. There were no signs of life here, at least none that Zavi could detect. The perfect place to hide. Zavi landed the ship on a small moon orbiting one of the gas giants in the system. It was a barren, desolate place. No cities, no civilizations, just empty space and rocky terrain. They hoped the quiet would shield them, that the silence would keep them hidden from the eyes of the galaxy. Zavi stepped out of the ship, breathing in the cold, stale air. The surface of the moon was covered in a fine dust, and in the distance, the gas giant loomed, its swirling storm clouds glowing faintly in the dark. "We'll be safe here," Zavi murmured, more to themselves than to Emery, who was standing behind them, wide-eyed. For the first time in weeks, Zavi felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this place could provide the sanctuary they needed. Maybe the galaxy would forget, and Emery would grow up in peace. But deep down, Zavi knew that hiding wouldn't be enough forever. The galaxy was vast, and the galaxy was watching. Humanity had returned to the stars, and there was no going back. The return of humanity was not just a whisper anymore. The galaxy would soon learn that one human child had survived the darkness of the past, and no matter how far Zavi ran, no matter how hidden they tried to make themselves, Emery's presence in the galaxy was a spark that would set off a chain of events no one could predict. The hunt had begun. The small moon orbited slowly around the gas giant, its rocky surface barren and untouched. The sky above was dark, only a few stars visible through the thick atmosphere. The cold, stale air bit at Zavi's skin as they stood outside the small spacecraft, gazing into the void of space. The silence of the place was almost comforting. After the chaos of the last few weeks, it felt like a moment of peace. But deep down, Xavi knew that peace was fragile. It wouldn't last forever. Xavi turned back toward the ship, their gaze shifting to Emery, who was standing at the door, looking out into the desolate landscape with wide eyes. The child had been remarkably quiet since they'd arrived on the moon, no longer asking questions or searching for answers. There was an understanding between them now, an unspoken agreement. Xavi would protect Emery, and Emery would trust Xavi. But trust could only go so far. Xavi knew that hiding out on this barren moon was just a temporary solution. The galaxy was vast, but it was not a place where anyone, could stay hidden forever. There were too many eyes in the stars. Xavi had lived long enough to understand the power of information, and once the signals from the research station had been sent, the hunt for Emery had begun. It wasn't just a matter of running or hiding. It was about survival. And that meant staying one step ahead of whoever might come after them. They had to be careful. They had to be smart. Xavi spent the following days set. Meanwhile, Emery spent their time exploring the moon's surface. The child was curious, as always, poking around the rocky outcroppings, digging in the dust, and watching the stars. They didn't seem bothered by the isolation of their new surroundings. To Emery, this strange moon was just another adventure, another new world to explore. It wasn't until one afternoon that everything began to unravel. Xavi was finishing a routine scan of the surrounding area when they noticed a faint blip on their scanner. At first, they thought it was a mistake, just a glitch in the system. But as the signal grew stronger, Xavi's heart began to race. They quickly ran to the communication console, trying to analyze the transmission. It was a faint signal, coming from somewhere on the edge of the moon's orbit. It was far enough that it could have easily been missed, but Xavi knew better than to ignore it. It wasn't long before the truth became clear. Someone had found them. Xavi's first instinct was to hide. They had always been cautious, always thinking one step ahead. The galaxy was vast, yes, but it was also interconnected. There were always ways for the powerful to track down those who didn't belong. Xavi had spent their entire life learning how to avoid detection, how to blend in, how to stay out of the eye of the galaxy's most dangerous players. But this time, it was different. They weren't just hiding from any random person. They were hiding from a force that would stop at nothing to capture Emery. The faint signal turned into a sharper, clearer transmission, and soon, Xavi knew they were not alone. There was a ship out there, just beyond the moon's orbit. Xavi didn't recognize the ship's signature, but that didn't matter. They could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being hunted. Xavi quickly powered up the ship's systems, preparing to leave the moon. They had to move fast. The moon offered no real protection, and a confrontation here would be disastrous. They needed to escape, find somewhere even more isolated, somewhere they could regroup and make a plan. Xavi turned to Emery, who was playing with a few scraps of metal just outside the shelter. The child looked up as Xavi approached, their face lighting up with the same innocent curiosity they always showed. But Xavi could see the tension in their eyes. Emery had sensed something was wrong. They could feel it too. "We need to go," Xavi said, their voice firm. "Now." Emery didn't ask questions. They simply nodded and ran toward the ship. Xavi followed quickly behind, hoping they could make it before the unknown ship closed in on them. The ship was ready for takeoff, and Xavi engaged the thrusters, lifting them off the surface of the moon. The ship's engines hummed to life, sending vibrations through the hull as they slowly ascended. Xavi watched the scanner, their heart pounding in their chest. The ship's signature was still there, still tracking them, but they were already too far from the moon's surface to be caught easily. Xavi punched in a new course, heading for the outer reaches of the system. They had to shake the other ship off their trail, but they needed to move quickly. Xavi's fingers danced across the controls, working with precision and urgency. The ship's engines roared louder as they pushed forward at maximum speed. We can't let them catch us, Zavi muttered under their breath, eyes glued to the scanner. We can't let them find you, Emery. Behind them, Emery was quiet. Zavi glanced back, seeing the child's face pressed against the glass of the ship's viewport, eyes wide as they watched the stars blur past. There was no way for Emery to understand the danger. Zavi had tried to protect them from the truth, but it seemed like the truth was catching up to them anyway. As they neared the edge of the system, Zavi could feel the pull of the unknown ship getting closer. The faint signal from earlier had now grown into a powerful beacon, indicating the other ship was closing in on them. Zavi's heart sank as they saw the unfamiliar vessel appear on the scanner. It was large, massive, in fact, bigger than anything Zavi had ever seen before. Its cold, metallic structure gleamed in the distance, a silent predator that could easily overpower their small craft. Zavi knew they couldn't outrun it forever. The larger ship had the power to chase them down, and they had nowhere to hide in the vast emptiness of space. Zavi had been running for days, but it was clear that they had reached the end of their escape. Suddenly, the comm system buzzed to life. A voice, deep and cold, crackled through the speakers, sending a chill through Zavi's spine. This is Captain Core of the Apex. Surrender now, and your life, and the child's, will be spared. If you continue to run, we will not hesitate to destroy you. Zavi's hands tightened on the controls. The Apex. They knew that name. The Apex was a powerful mercenary fleet known for their ruthlessness, a group that took on the most dangerous and high-profile jobs across the galaxy. If they had been sent after Emery, it meant someone with power, and with a great deal of influence, was involved. Zavi took a deep breath. They couldn't risk being captured. They couldn't allow Emery to fall into their hands. The child was too important, too valuable. Zavi quickly glanced at Emery, who had heard the voice through the comm system, and now stood frozen, staring wide-eyed at Zavi. We have to fight, Zavi said, their voice determined. Hold on tight, Emery. Zavi turned the ship, aiming straight for the heart of the approaching fleet. They had no weapons, no real defense, but they weren't going down without a fight. Zavi's fingers flew across the controls, engaging the ship's emergency systems, triggering every maneuvering thruster they could. The ship lurched forward, breaking through the empty space with a speed that startled even Zavi. The unknown ship wasn't expecting this move, and Zavi hoped it would be enough to throw them off. The chase had just begun. Zavi's heart raced as they made quick adjustments to the ship's controls, urging the small vessel to speed toward the stars. The cold, barren moon was quickly falling behind them, and the emptiness of space stretched out before them. However, that emptiness was no longer comforting. It felt like a vast hunting ground, where no matter how fast they flew, the predators were always close behind. Zavi had thought that this moon, with its remote location far from any major trade routes or inhabited planets, would be a perfect hiding spot. But now, as the unfamiliar ship closed in on them, it became painfully clear that no place in the galaxy was truly safe anymore. Zavi couldn't afford to panic. They had promised Emery, this precious, innocent human child, they would protect them. Zavi wasn't sure how they could do it, but one thing was certain: they would not give up without a fight. As the spacecraft soared through the dark expanse of space, Zavi glanced over at Emery, who sat quietly in the corner of the cockpit, eyes wide but calm. There was a certain stillness about the child, as if they understood on some deep, unspoken level that something terrible was about to unfold. Emery had already gone through so much since they had been found in the cryopod on the research station, alone, confused, and now hunted by the entire galaxy. Yet, Emery showed no signs of fear. There was a quiet bravery in the child's eyes, and Zavi felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to protect that innocence. Zavi's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden blip on the scanner. The Apex ship was no longer just a faint signal. It was right on top of them. Zavi could feel the pressure rising, as if the air itself had become denser. The larger ship was gaining fast. The Apex, a fleet of mercenaries known for their efficiency and deadly capabilities, was notorious across the galaxy. Sci-Fi knew about them well. Rumors of their ruthless operations and their involvement in some of the most dangerous missions had spread far and wide. But this was something different. They weren't after some rogue criminal or a stolen ship. They were after a child. Emery. Sci-Fi. Emery's voice broke through the tension in the air, soft but clear. What's happening? Sci-Fi didn't know how to explain it. How could they tell a child that the galaxy was hunting them down? That their life was worth more than just survival, but a key to unlocking some of the universe's greatest mysteries or dangers? Sci-Fi took a deep breath. We're being followed. There are bad people who want to hurt you, Emery. We have to keep moving. Emery nodded, their expression serious, but there was no fear in their eyes. Sci-Fi couldn't help but admire the child's bravery. They didn't even fully understand the weight of the situation, but they trusted Sci-Fi without question. Sci-Fi turned their attention back to the controls. Their mind raced for a solution, any plan that could buy them enough time to escape. But the reality was harsh. There was no easy way out of this. The Apex ship was larger, more powerful, and it was catching up with them. Sci-Fi's small craft was agile, but it was underpowered compared to the heavy warship that followed them. Sci-Fi quickly checked the data on the ship's systems. They had a few options left. They could try to jump to a different part of the galaxy, but that would take time. And the Apex had the technology to track ships through hyperspace. They could try to hide, but the chances of evading a ship like the Apex were slim. There was only one option left: fight. Sci-Fi's hands hovered over the controls. The ship wasn't built for combat. It wasn't a warship, but a scientific vessel, designed for exploration and research. However, Sci-Fi had made modifications in the past. They had installed some basic defense systems. Nothing fancy, just enough to get them out of tight spots. Now, it looked like they would need everything they had. Sci-Fi engaged the emergency defense systems, activating the ship's limited weaponry. The ship's lasers powered up, but Sci-Fi knew they were no match for the Apex's advanced weaponry. Still, they had to try. If they could just delay the enemy long enough to escape, maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. Hold on, Emery, Sci-Fi called out, their voice steady but laced with tension. It's going to get rough. Emery nodded, gripping the edge of the seat with small, determined hands. There was no question in the child's eyes. They trusted Sci-Fi, and they were ready to face whatever came next. Sci-Fi couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. This child, this human child, was stronger than they had imagined. The Apex ship loomed larger in the viewport, its cold, metallic surface reflecting the distant light of the stars. It was massive, a true behemoth in space, with weapons bristling along its hull. Sci-Fi's ship was small in comparison, like a speck of dust next to a mountain. The Apex was a predator, and Sci-Fi's ship was its prey. Sci-Fi pushed the throttle forward, and the ship surged forward, weaving and dodging through the void of space. The Apex followed, maintaining its relentless pursuit. Sci-Fi's mind worked quickly, trying to think of a way to outmaneuver the massive warship. Suddenly, a loud boom rocked the ship, and Sci-Fi's grip tightened on the controls. The Apex had fired a warning shot, a clear message that they wouldn't be messing around. Sci-Fi could feel the vibrations of the blast rippling through the ship's hull. The shields held, but only barely. They're not playing around, Sci-Fi muttered, eyes darting between the ship's systems and the approaching enemy. The Apex ship fired again, this time with more precision. The blast was aimed directly at Sci-Fi's ship. A direct hit would mean destruction. Sci-Fi swerved to the side, just barely dodging the blast. The ship rocked violently, and the warning alarms blared as the shields began to flicker. Sci-Fi, Emery cried, their voice filled with fear this time. Are we going to be okay? Sci-Fi quickly glanced over at the child. We're going to be fine. Just stay down and stay safe." Emery nodded, but the fear was evident in their eyes. Xivi's stomach twisted in knots, knowing they were on the edge of survival. The next move could determine everything. Xivi's mind raced for another plan. There was a small asteroid field up ahead, a dense cluster of rocks and debris. If they could get there, they might have a chance to hide and lose the Apex's trail. It was risky, dodging asteroids in a ship that wasn't made for evasive maneuvers. But it was their only chance. Xivi turned the ship, aiming for the asteroid field. The ship's engines roared as they raced toward the debris, but Xivi knew they had to move fast. The Apex was relentless, and they wouldn't hesitate to destroy them if they got close enough. As Xivi maneuvered the ship through the field, the sensors beeped wildly. Asteroids of various sizes floated in their path, and Xivi's hands moved like lightning, making adjustments and twisting the controls to avoid a collision. The ship jostled, the sudden shifts in direction throwing them both off balance. Xivi's eyes flicked back to the scanner. The Apex wasn't far behind. In fact, they were closing in, even with the asteroid field in their way. The Apex ship's size and firepower allowed it to plow through the debris, while Xivi's ship was a much smaller, more fragile target. "We need to make this count, Emery," Xivi muttered, setting their jaw. "Hold on tight." Emery grabbed the seat with both hands, their face pale but resolute. The child didn't question. They trusted Xivi, trusted them with everything. And that trust made Xivi more determined than ever to survive this. Xivi glanced ahead and saw a massive asteroid just ahead. It was big enough to hide behind, if they could get there in time. With a final decisive move, Xivi pushed the ship into full throttle, steering them toward the asteroid. The Apex ship followed closely, its guns powering up for another shot. Xivi's heart pounded as they flew toward the asteroid, barely avoiding the incoming fire from the Apex. The asteroid was their last hope. If they could just make it behind the rock, they could hide long enough to escape. They were almost there. The ship screeched as it swerved around the massive rock, just as a blast from the Apex exploded behind them. The ship rattled violently, but Xivi managed to get behind the asteroid, using it as cover. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Xivi's ship was hidden in the shadow of the asteroid, and the Apex ship, unable to track them through the debris, hesitated, searching for a way to flush them out. Xivi held their breath. It was a small victory, but in this moment, it was enough. They had escaped. For now. But Xivi knew one thing. The hunt was far from over. The Apex wasn't going to give up. And neither would Xivi. The cold emptiness of space stretched out before them, endless and full of quiet. Xivi sat at the controls of their ship, staring at the dark expanse beyond the viewport. They had been flying for days now, moving from one uncharted area to the next, trying to stay one step ahead of the Apex fleet. The constant pressure of being hunted never seemed to ease, but Xivi knew they had no choice. They had to keep moving, for Emery's sake. Xivi had tried to make the ship as comfortable as possible, using what little they had to make the small space feel like home. The metallic walls were dull and gray, but there were blankets on the floor for Emery, a small area with toys and drawings that the child had made. The room felt a bit more personal now, a little warmer in its own way. But no matter how hard Xivi tried to make things seem normal, the weight of their situation was always present, like a shadow following them wherever they went. Emery had been quieter than usual. The child still asked questions, still wanted to know what was going to happen next, but the energy they once had was fading. Emery had always been curious, adventurous, with a sense of wonder that Xivi admired. But now, it seemed as though Emery was beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. There was no more pretending that everything was okay. The hunt was real. The danger was real. Xivi glanced over at the child, who was sitting on the floor, looking out the small porthole, their eyes distant. Emery's small hands were clutching a stuffed toy tightly, their expression pensive. Xivi's heart ached for the child. They had been through so much, Too much for someone so young. Zyvi wished they could take away the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, but all they could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. Zyvi stood up from the pilot's seat and walked over to Emery, kneeling down to their level. Emery didn't immediately look up, but Zyvi could see the slight tremor in the child's shoulders. "We'll be okay, Emery," Zyvi said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "I know it's scary, but we're going to make it through. We just have to be smart, and we have to stay together." Emery finally turned their head, looking up at Zyvi with wide eyes. There was a mix of fear and hope in their gaze, a silent plea for reassurance. Zyvi smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Emery's face. "You're not alone," Zyvi added, their voice steady. "We'll get through this. I promise." For a moment, the two of them just sat there, a quiet understanding between them. The coldness of space outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. It was just the two of them now, bound together by necessity, but also by something more, something deeper. The child was the reason Zyvi kept going. And in a way, Zyvi realized, Emery was the only thing keeping them alive too. The days blurred together as they continued to flee through the galaxy. Every now and then, Zyvi would check the ship's scanners for any signs of pursuit. So far, they had managed to stay hidden from the apex. But Zyvi knew this peace wouldn't last. Eventually, they would have to face what was coming. It was during one of these tense moments, as Zyvi adjusted the ship's course yet again, that a strange signal popped up on their radar. At first, Zyvi thought it was just another glitch, but as they examined it closer, the signal began to look familiar. It was a faint distress signal, one that seemed to be coming from an abandoned space station. Zyvi frowned. This was odd. The station hadn't been on any of the charts. It wasn't in any of the usual trade routes, and it wasn't a place that would attract attention. But that was precisely why it might be worth checking out. If the station was truly abandoned, it could provide a safe place to rest, repair the ship, and maybe even find some answers. And if it was truly abandoned, there was a chance they could hide there long enough to plan their next move. "We're going to check this out," Zyvi muttered to themselves, making the decision in an instant. There was no time to waste. If they were lucky, this abandoned station might offer the reprieve they desperately needed. Zyvi set a course for the station and engaged the ship's thrusters. Emery looked up from their seat, sensing the change in direction. "Where are we going now?" Emery asked, their voice still quiet but curious. "We're going to check out a space station," Zyvi said. "It might be a safe place for us to rest." Emery nodded but said nothing more. The child had become eerily quiet over the past few days, and Zyvi couldn't help but feel the weight of their silence. Emery had always been full of questions, but now it seemed as if the child had stopped asking. Zyvi wondered if it was because Emery was simply too tired of hearing the same answers, or if, deep down, they knew that no answer could truly ease the fear they were both living with. The station appeared on their scanner about an hour later. As they approached, Zyvi could see the faint outline of the structure against the backdrop of distant stars. It was an old station, its surface covered in patches of debris, some areas looking as though they had been abandoned for years. There were no signs of life, no signals, no movement, just silence. Zyvi slowed the ship's speed as they drew closer. They needed to be cautious. It was possible that someone, or something, was still lurking in the abandoned station. But the chances of it being a trap were slim. This place was too far off the beaten path for any serious players to keep watch over. Zyvi docked the ship in one of the outer bays, the metal groaning slightly as the docking clamps latched onto place. Once the ship was secured, Zyvi powered down the engines and turned to Emery. "Stay close to me," Zyvi said gently, standing up. "We don't know what's here, so we need to be careful." Emery nodded, standing up slowly and walking over to Zyvi. The child's small hand grasped Zyvi's firmly. For a moment, it felt like everything in the galaxy had slowed down. It was just the two of them, standing together, facing whatever came next. The inside of the space station was eerily quiet. The air was stale, and the lighting was dim, but it wasn't completely dark. Dust floated in the air as Xavi and Emery made their way down the narrow corridors. The walls were covered in old, peeling metal, and there were signs of wear and tear everywhere. This place had long been abandoned, its systems long since gone offline. Xavi scanned the area, looking for any signs of activity. They were in a maintenance corridor, the kind of place where few would ever go. It seemed safe, at least for now. They came to a large room at the center of the station, one that seemed to have been a command center of sorts. There were old terminals still hooked up to the station's power grid, though most of them were offline. Xavi moved cautiously toward one of the terminals, attempting to power it up. After a few seconds, the screen flickered to life, displaying a series of static-filled messages. Xavi's heart skipped a beat. The messages seemed old, but one stood out, dated just a few days ago. It was a message from a nearby research station, a message about a young human child who had been found. The words seemed to echo in Xavi's mind, confirming something they had feared for a long time. Emery's discovery had set off a chain of events that had drawn far more attention than they had realized. Xavi quickly powered down the terminal, wiping the screen clean. They had to be careful. They couldn't afford to leave a trace of their presence. The Apex could still be looking for them. As they turned to leave the room, Xavi felt a strange sense of determination. This station, while not the perfect hiding place, could still be the beginning of something new. Maybe, just maybe, they could turn this into a new home, at least for a while. They weren't finished yet. There was still hope. Xavi grabbed Emery's hand once more, squeezing it tightly. "This is just the beginning," Xavi said softly. "We'll figure this out, together." And as they walked out of the station's command center, a small spark of hope lit up inside them. They weren't running anymore. They were planning. They were fighting back. This was the start of a new beginning. The stars outside seemed a little less cold now.